June 1944. France was still bleeding. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The beaches of Omaha and Utah were choked with smoke, bodies, and fire. The world had begun to turn against Hitler's war machine. But 50 miles inland, tucked between rolling hills and apple orchards, there was a village called Saint-Mère-Église, so small it didn't even appear on most maps. A few dozen stone houses, one church with a broken bell, a cafe with no coffee left, and people who were just trying to survive. For 4 years, Saint-Mère-Église had lived under German occupation. Soldiers in gray uniforms patrolled its narrow lanes. Curfews ruled the night. The local baker, old Monsieur Lavigne, had to hand over half his bread each morning to feed the occupiers. Every week, trucks rumbled through, taking chickens, wine, even bicycles for the army. No one dared speak too loud. The walls had ears, and collaboration or rebellion both carried the same price: death. But everything began to change in the summer of 1944. On the night of June 6th, distant thunder rolled across the horizon, not weather, but war. The villagers awoke to flashes on the skyline and the distant hum of airplanes. Then came the parachutes, dozens of them, white ghosts drifting down in the moonlight, carrying men with strange helmets and flags stitched to their sleeves, the Americans. The next morning, Saint-Mère-Église was split in two. To the north, German troops still held the road to Carentan. To the south, a handful of American paratroopers, lost, scattered, wounded, had taken shelter inside the village church, and caught between them were the villagers themselves. Among them was Marie Duval, 28 years old, the daughter of a school teacher. Her husband had been taken by the Germans 2 years earlier, forced to work in a munitions factory in Germany. She hadn't heard from him since. Every night she prayed not for freedom, but simply for quiet, a day without fear. That morning she found it shattered. A young American, his uniform torn, his face streaked with mud, stumbled into her yard, bleeding from the shoulder. He could barely stand. Marie didn't think. She acted. She dragged him inside, hid him behind the old bread oven, and locked the door. His name was Private Jack Turner, 21, from Ohio. He spoke no French, she spoke no English, but fear has a universal language. When he flinched at the sound of boots outside, she put a finger to her lips. When he gasped in pain, she handed him water. He whispered one word she understood: merci.
That night, the village became a trap. German patrols searched every barn and cellar. They knew Allied soldiers had fallen nearby. Jack was one of them. Marie sat by the oven, a pistol hidden under her apron, an old revolver her father had buried before the war. She listened to the footsteps outside, praying they wouldn't knock on her door. But fate, it seemed, wasn't ready to take her yet. The patrol passed, the boots faded, and in that silence, something began. Not just between a woman and a soldier, but between two worlds that had never meant to meet. The next morning, the church bell, the one that hadn't rung since 1940, tolled once, a signal. The villagers knew what it meant. The Americans are here, but so did the Germans. And within hours, Saint-Mère-Église would become the center of a battle that history almost forgot. A battle where locals and GIs stood together, not as conquerors and civilians, but as equals, defending a village that belonged to neither, and both. Morning broke gray and heavy. A mist hung low over the fields, swallowing the distant hills in silence. The air smelled of wet grass and cordite, the strange metallic scent that always followed a firefight. For the villagers of Saint-Mère-Église, it was the smell of something they hadn't felt in years: change. Private Jack Turner sat by the window of Marie's small cottage, clutching his rifle, an M1 Garand with a cracked stock. His uniform was still damp from the night's rain, and his wound burned where she had bandaged it. Through the glass, he could see the square, the cafe, the bakery, the old water pump. Everything looked calm, too calm. Marie entered quietly, holding a cup of weak coffee, made from roasted barley, not beans. Jack smiled faintly. He didn't understand her words, but her tone was kind, almost motherly. Then came the sound. Faint at first, then sharper. Engines. German trucks. Marie froze. She looked toward the window, eyes wide. Jack stood instantly, rifle ready. From the north road, 2 Opel Blitz trucks rolled in, great paint glinting under the morning light. A dozen German soldiers jumped out, rifles slung, helmets shining. The sergeant barked orders, his boots slamming the cobblestones like hammers. In the church across the square, Lieutenant Robert Bobby Hayes, commander of the stranded American paratroopers, saw them too. He had 7 men left. They were tired, low on ammunition, and completely cut off. But now there was no choice. He whispered, "Boys, looks like company's here."
The first shot came from the bell tower, a clean, echoing crack that sliced through the morning quiet. A German soldier dropped where he stood. The square exploded with gunfire. Glass shattered, pigeons scattered from the rooftops. The Americans fired from windows, from behind stone walls, from the church's broken doors. Marie ducked low, pulling Jack away from the window. Bullets smacked into the walls, sending dust across the floor. The smell of smoke filled the room. "Stay down," Jack shouted, waving her back. But Marie, stubborn and fierce, grabbed the pistol her father had hidden years ago. She opened the cellar door. "I hide you," she whispered in broken English. "No, I fight too." Jack stared at her, at this woman who had lived under occupation for 4 years and still refused to cower. For the first time since landing in France, he felt something new, respect, deeper than words. Outside, chaos consumed the square. The Germans tried to flank the church, but old Monsieur Levine, the baker, rolled a barrel of flour into the street and set it ablaze. Smoke billowed out, thick and white, blinding the attackers. The villagers began shouting, banging pots, creating noise and confusion. They weren't soldiers, but they were no longer afraid. Hayes used the smoke to move his men across the square. "Go, cover fire," he yelled. They sprinted from wall to wall, bullets whizzing past their heads. One fell, hit in the leg, but another dragged him behind a well. The ground was slick with rain and blood. By noon, the Germans had pulled back to regroup. The village was half in ruins. The cafe burned, the church's front doors were gone. But the American flag, improvised from a torn parachute, fluttered from the tower like a ghost. Inside the church, Hayes spread a map on a crate. Jack arrived minutes later, escorted by Marie. "She's the one who patched me up," he said, catching his breath. "And I think she saved my life." Hayes nodded, looking at her with gratitude. "Then she's one of us." The villagers slowly gathered in the nave. Farmers, old women, even children. They didn't have much, a few hunting rifles, some old pistols, kitchen knives. But their eyes burned with the same determination. Hayes took a deep breath. "All right, listen up. We hold this village. Reinforcements are coming. Maybe a day, maybe 2. Until then, this is our line." A murmur spread through the crowd. Someone translated his words into French. The villagers nodded, some trembling, some smiling. They were ready. That night, the church became their fortress. Candles flickered against the cracked walls. Marie helped the wounded. The Americans cleaned their weapons, whispered about home, about baseball, about anything that kept fear away. Outside, thunder rolled, not from the sky, but from tanks moving in the distance. They knew what tomorrow would bring. And yet, in that moment, under that broken roof, Americans and French villagers shared bread, laughter, and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could hold out.
The dawn broke with a red sky.
A sailor's warning, they used to say. But in Saint-Mère-Église, it meant only one thing. The Germans were coming. The air was thick with the smell of mud and smoke. A thin fog clung to the ground, twisting between ruined cottages and shattered wagons. The once peaceful square was now a fortress. Overturned carts formed barricades. Broken beams turned into cover, and sandbags were piled by every doorway. Inside the church, Lieutenant Hayes stood by the map again, tracing a trembling finger along the narrow road leading to the north. "They'll come from here," he said, his voice hoarse. "Scouts saw a column of armor an hour ago. At least 2 pens or 4s, maybe more." Private Turner exhaled sharply. "Panzers? We've got rifles and a prayer." "Then we make both count," Hayes said. They had only 8 Americans left, tired, dirty, running on almost no sleep, and maybe 20 villagers who had volunteered to fight. Some of the French men were farmers. Others had never even held a weapon before this week. But fear had turned to fire inside them. They weren't just defending a town anymore. They were defending their dignity. Outside, the first rumble echoed through the valley. The ground trembled. The sound grew, not like thunder this time, but like a heartbeat. Marie ran to the bell tower, peering through the fog. "They come!" she shouted. "Tanks!" The villagers froze. Every second stretched like an hour. Hayes grabbed his binoculars, and there they were. Dark silhouettes rolling out of the mist. Iron monsters with black crosses painted on their sides. Behind them, a dozen trucks, packed with infantry. "Positions!" Hayes yelled. "Everyone get ready!" The defenders scattered. Turner took the upper window of the bakery. Weber and Levine crouched behind sandbags near the main street. Marie stayed in the church with the wounded, loading clips and passing ammo. The tanks rolled closer, their engines growling like beasts. The first one fired. The shell smashed into a cottage, splintering it into fire and dust. The blast shook the church windows. Screams followed. One villager was gone before anyone could even see who. "Hold your fire. Wait till they're close." The Germans advanced, confident. They didn't expect real resistance, not from a ruined village. But as they reached the square, a single gunshot rang out, then another, and another. The villagers had opened fire. Rifles cracked from windows, grenades exploded behind carts, smoke and screams filled the air. The first panzer's treads rolled over debris, unstoppable, until boom, a Molotov cocktail burst against its side. Flames crawled up the armor. The tank didn't stop. "More fire!" Hayes yelled.
Turner leaned out from his window, lit another bottle, and hurled it with everything he had. It shattered across the turret, flames licking upward like hungry claws. The German crew panicked. The hatch flew open, 2 men climbing out, their uniforms burning. "Now!" Hayes yelled. The Americans fired, and the tank fell silent. But there was another, and another. Explosions rocked the square. Dirt and bodies flew. The Germans poured machine gun fire into the streets, shredding walls to splinters. One villager fell beside the pump, clutching his chest. Another tried to pull him back, and was hit too. Inside the church, the wounded moaned beneath flickering candles. Marie tried to stay calm, pressing her hands to a man's wound, whispering prayers. Then the door burst open. Smoke poured in, and with it, Hayes, coughing, dragging Turner by the shoulder. "We can't hold the square," he shouted. "Fall back." Marie shook her head. "Where?" Hayes pointed toward the crypt beneath the church. "Down there, the old tunnels. You said they lead to the woods, right?" Yes, but they're collapsed." "Then we dig." They moved fast. The last defenders covered the retreat, firing bursts from the windows. Grenades rolled across the floor, shaking the pews. As the church doors splintered, Hayes, Turner, Marie, and 5 others rushed into the crypt below. The air was cold and wet. Candles barely flickered in the damp darkness. The tunnels stretched out, narrow stone passages, half flooded, smelling of mold and old death. They could hear the thunder above, the sound of the Germans storming the church. Turner leaned against the wall, panting. "We're trapped." Hayes looked up at the vaulted ceiling. "Not yet." He turned to Marie. "You said your grandfather hid people down here during the last war." "Yes," she said, pointing to a side tunnel. "He built a secret exit near the riverbank." They followed her lead, crawling through darkness, carrying what weapons they could. The sound of boots echoed behind them, German soldiers searching the crypt. Flashlights cut through the black. Voices shouted in harsh, clipped tones. Hayes whispered, "Move faster." They reached the end of the passage, a crumbling brick wall. Marie pressed her hand against it. "Here," she said. "It used to open." Turner rammed his shoulder into it. Once, twice, the wall cracked. Dust poured down. A beam of pale daylight pierced through. One more hit, and the bricks gave way. They stumbled out into the woods, collapsing under the open sky. Behind them, Saint-Mère-Église was burning.
Flames rose from the church spire, curling smoke into the heavens. The sound of gunfire faded as the village fell silent again, but not defeatedly. Because the Germans hadn't won. The Americans and villagers had escaped, carrying with them the spirit of resistance. Hayes looked back, jaw clenched. "We'll come back," he said quietly. "We'll rebuild." Marie stood beside him, her face streaked with soot but unbroken. "You gave us courage," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, you already had it. You just needed a reason to show it." The group disappeared into the forest, leaving behind ashes, courage, and the echo of a stand that would be remembered not for victory, but for defiance. The forest swallowed them whole. The night air was freezing, and mist coiled through the trees like ghosts. Every step was agony, mud sucking at their boots, branches clawing at their faces. The men stumbled forward, led by the faint light of a single lantern Marie carried. Behind them, Saint-Mère-Église still burned. The orange glow on the horizon flickered through the mist like the dying breath of something once sacred. They walked for hours, in silence broken only by the crunch of twigs and the occasional low rumble of distant artillery. Finally, when exhaustion overtook them, Hayes raised his hand. "Rest," he said softly. Turner collapsed against a tree trunk, gulping air. "How far you think we got?" "Not far enough. If the Germans send patrols, they'll sweep this forest by morning." Marie sat beside him, shivering. She looked smaller now, her face pale in the moonlight. "My uncle's farm. It's north of here, maybe 3 kilometers. If it's still standing, we can hide there." Hayes nodded. "Then that's where we go." They waited till dawn, moving again as the first light cut through the fog. The air smelled of smoke and wet earth. When they finally reached the clearing, they saw the farmhouse, surprisingly intact, surrounded by empty fields and the skeletons of burned-out trucks. But something felt wrong. No birds, no wind, just silence. Hayes motioned for Turner to flank left. He and Marie moved toward the door. It creaked open under his hand. Inside, a wreck. Chairs overturned, dishes shattered, a bloodstain on the floorboards. "Someone was here," Turner said, lowering his rifle. Marie knelt beside the stain, touching it with trembling fingers. "Uncle," she whispered. Before Hayes could respond, a sound, faint but clear, echoed from beneath the floorboards. A voice, a whisper. He motioned for quiet and lifted one of the broken planks. Beneath it, a small hatch. He pried it open, and a man's hand reached out. "Easy," Hayes said, grabbing it. "We're friends."
From the dark space below,
A bearded man crawled out, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Americans?" he gasped. "You're alive?" Marie threw her arms around him. "Uncle Pierre!" He clung to her, shaking. "The Germans came 2 nights ago. They burned everything. But some of us hid. There are more in the cellar, women, children." Hayes helped lift the hatch wider. 6 faces stared up, frightened, dirt-covered, but alive. Pierre turned to him. "You shouldn't have come. They've occupied the next village. Tanks, infantry. They'll be here soon." Hayes stared through the cracked window toward the distant road. He could see it already. Faint black smoke on the horizon. German armor on the move. He looked at Turner. "We can't just hide. We've got weapons, what's left of them. We know this ground. If we can slow them down—" Turner interrupted. "Sir, with what? Rifles and a prayer? You said it yourself." Hayes didn't answer at first. He walked to the corner of the barn, knelt, and brushed straw aside. Beneath it, a trap door. He opened it. Crates of explosives, half buried. Old mining charges, maybe left from before the war. Pierre's eyes widened. They were for clearing stone, but they still work. Hayes smiled grimly. "Then we've got a fighting chance." By nightfall, they had a plan. They split into 3 small teams. Hayes and Turner would rig the bridge with explosives. Marie and Pierre would guide the civilians through the woods to safety. Weber and 2 others would set up an ambush along the main road. The moon was hidden behind clouds, perfect cover. Hayes and Turner worked silently by the river, the icy water biting at their hands. They tied charges under the wooden planks, each one wired to a detonator hidden behind the embankment. Turner's voice was low. "It feels like suicide, sir." Hayes looked up. "Maybe it is, but if we don't stop them, they'll kill everyone who can't run." A beat of silence. Then Turner nodded. "Then let's make it count." When they finished, they crawled back into the tree line, breath fogging in the cold air. In the distance, they could already hear engines, rumbling, steady, coming closer. At the farmhouse, Marie was helping the last child into the wagon. Her uncle pressed her hand. "You must go," he said. "I'll cover the rear." "No," she whispered. "We stay together." But before either could argue, the first shell exploded in the field. Dirt and debris rained down. The Germans were here.
Weber's voice came through the radio, crackling but clear. "Convoy sighted. Dozens of men. Tanks, half-tracks. They're heading for the bridge." Hayes whispered, "Hold until they're halfway across." They waited. The sound of treads on wood grew louder, heavy, rhythmic, like drums of war. The first tank rolled onto the bridge, its headlights cutting through the fog. Another followed, then trucks. Hayes watched from the brush, thumb hovering over the detonator. His heart hammered in his chest. Turner crouched beside him, eyes wide. Then, boom! The entire bridge erupted in a wall of fire and splinters. The first tank plunged into the river, dragging the second down with it. Trucks screeched, men screamed, the air filled with smoke and chaos. "Now!" Hayes yelled. Rifles cracked, grenades exploded among the panicked soldiers. Weber's team rained bullets from the ridge. The Germans scattered, some diving into the water, others firing blindly into the trees. Turner reloaded, firing into the confusion. "That's for Saint-Mère-Église," he shouted. The ambush tore through the column, but the Germans recovered fast, too fast. Machine gun fire raked the tree line. Turner ducked, dirt spraying his face. A bullet grazed his arm. Hayes grabbed him, dragging him deeper into cover. "Fall back, to the farmhouse." They ran through the smoke and rain, lungs burning, bullets slicing the air around them. When they burst into the clearing, the farmhouse was half in flames. Marie was still there, helping the last civilians into the woods. "Go," she shouted. "We'll cover you." Pierre stayed behind, rifle in hand. "You think I'll run while you fight? Never." Hayes opened his mouth to protest, but then the roar of an engine silenced everything. A Panzer emerged from the fog, its turret turning toward them. Turner dove behind the well, firing uselessly at the thick armor.
Hayes scrambled for the detonator pack, one last charge wired near the barn. He yanked the cord, pressed the button, boom! The explosion engulfed the Panzer's side, flipping it in a wave of dirt and flame. The ground shook, the roof of the barn collapsed, smoke covered everything. When the dust settled, the Panzer was gone, twisted metal half buried in fire. Hayes coughed, struggling to stand. Turner limped beside him, blood on his sleeve. Marie emerged from the tree line, her face streaked with ash. "It's over," she said quietly. He looked at her, eyes heavy with exhaustion. "No, not over. But today, we won." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe there's still hope."
Smoke drifted lazily over the shattered rooftops of the small German town. What had once been cobblestone charm and red-tiled roofs was now rubble and ash. Windows gaped like open wounds, and church bells lay silent, twisted, blackened by fire. Amid the ruins, a man walked carefully, clutching a leather-bound book to his chest. His name was Meyer Heinrich Falk, and inside that book was the story of the town's final days, a record he hoped someone, someday, would find. The year was 1945, and the world around him was collapsing. The Reich was dying, the Allied forces were advancing from the west, and the Soviets were burning through the east. Caught in the middle were ordinary people, farmers, teachers, mothers, children, trapped between loyalty, fear, and the desperate hope that maybe, somehow, their town would survive. The mayor wrote every night by candlelight, the sound of distant artillery echoing in his ears. His handwriting, once neat and elegant, had grown shaky. Each page carried the smell of wax, smoke, and despair. March 29, 1945, he wrote, "The Americans are only a few days away. The soldiers left behind are boys, frightened, barely trained. They build barricades from furniture and bricks, but I know it won't matter. I fear for the town more than for myself." Outside, a small group of villagers tried to repair a water line bombed 2 nights earlier. Every explosion sent them diving to the ground, praying the next one wouldn't find them. Heinrich watched from the window, his heart heavy with guilt. He'd served as mayor since 1937, appointed by the party, though he'd never truly believed in its madness. But resisting had never been an option. Not then. April 1st, he wrote. The soldiers came. SS men. Strangers. They took the last food stores. They accused me of hiding supplies. I tried to reason, but they beat old Frau Adler in the street. No one dared speak. The people look at me as if I can save them, but I can't even protect myself. That night, Heinrich buried a small box under the steps of the town hall, containing his journal, a few photographs, and a letter to his wife, who had fled months earlier. He didn't know if he'd live to see her again. The sound of church bells echoed faintly. A signal. The Americans were close. Soldiers were already seen near the forest road. The town's last defenders, teenage boys and old men, stood trembling at their makeshift barricades. As shells began to fall, the mayor made one last entry. If anyone finds this, know that not all of us agreed with the madness. Some of us tried to keep our humanity, even when it cost us everything. Hours later, flames consumed the town hall. When Allied troops entered the ruins the next morning, they found bodies and ash, but not the diary. It remained hidden, buried beneath the rubble, forgotten by time. Decades later, in 1998, during a construction project to rebuild the square, workers unearthed a rusted metal box. Inside, the mayor's diary, preserved by luck and fate. The ink had faded, but the words still carried power, a voice from the ruins, whispering of guilt, loss,
and the human cost of loyalty. April 6, 1945. One of the last pages read, "The end is here, but perhaps someday, someone will understand what happened to us, not as villains, not as heroes, but as people who were simply caught in the storm."
Rain began to fall over the ruined town, soft at first, then harder, until the streets turned to rivers of mud and ash. Smoke from the bombed houses mixed with mist from the hills, making the whole valley look like a gray ghost of what it once was. The church spire, half broken, leaned to one side like it was bowing to the destruction around it. Only a few people remained alive among the ruins, huddled in basements, afraid to come out even after the guns had fallen silent. The Americans entered cautiously, their boots crunching over shattered glass. Sergeant Thomas Ward, a war-weary man from Ohio, was the first to push open the mayor's office door. The smell of smoke and burned paper filled his nose. He saw the town crest, cracked but still hanging on the wall, and beside it a desk covered in dust and blood. Papers fluttered in the wind that blew through a broken window. He picked one up. It was written in German, the ink smeared but still legible. The first words caught his attention. "This is not a confession. It is a memory." Ward called for a translator. A young corporal named Louis Meyer, whose parents had been born in Berlin, stepped forward. He began reading aloud, his voice quiet but clear. As the words flowed, even the hardened soldiers stopped to listen. It wasn't propaganda or military orders. It was something deeply human. The mayor had written about every face in the town. The blacksmith who refused to flee, the baker's son who joined the Hitler Youth and never came back, the schoolteacher who hid Jewish children in her cellar until the SS discovered them. The diary wasn't just a record of events, it was a map of broken hearts. April 3rd, one entry read, "They hanged the teacher today. The children screamed and the soldiers laughed. I did nothing. I wanted to, but I froze. I have never felt more ashamed. The party calls this strength, but it is cowardice dressed as obedience." Ward lowered the paper, his jaw tight. He looked around the office, the overturned chair, the burnt curtains, the shattered photograph of a woman and a little girl. "What happened to him?" he asked quietly. No one knew. The town's few survivors said the mayor disappeared during the final bombardment. Some claimed he was killed by retreating SS men for refusing to burn the archives. Others whispered that he took his own life, unwilling to face the guilt of what he had allowed. But there was no body, only the hidden box found decades later, containing the full story. Inside the diary's later pages, Heinrich's tone shifted from fear to resignation. He no longer wrote as a man trying to save his town, but as someone trying to make peace with his sins. He wrote, "We thought we were saving Germany, but we were only feeding a machine that devoured everything we loved." His last written words were almost a whisper on paper. "If you are reading this, know that silence is a weapon, and I used it far too well." After the war, the town was rebuilt. New houses stood where the ruins had been. Children played in the same streets once filled with soldiers. But beneath the square, under layers of new pavement, the soil still hid bones and memories. When the diary was rediscovered in 1998, it became a national story. Historians debated its authenticity, but the handwriting matched municipal records. The museum displayed it under glass, a relic of conscience preserved in ink and sorrow. Visitors often stood in silence, reading the final pages, feeling the weight of one man's words from half a century ago. At the museum opening, an elderly woman stepped forward. She introduced herself as Liesel Falk, the mayor's daughter. Her voice trembled as she read from her father's journal. "I hope one day my little girl will know I tried to make things right." She wiped her eyes. She said, "He wasn't a hero.
He was just tired and human.
The mayor's diary, once buried in fear, had finally found light, not as an excuse, but as a warning. That in war, the loudest voices may win battles, but it is the quiet ones who carry history in their hearts. Thunder rolled in the distance as Liesel closed the diary. The museum lights flickered slightly. A storm was coming, just like the one her father had described in his final pages. Visitors slowly left the hall, leaving her alone before the glass case. She rested her hand against it, tracing the faint outline of her father's handwriting through the glass. The guards gave her space. No one spoke. The sound of rain began to tap against the tall windows, echoing softly, a rhythm that matched the slow, heavy beat of memory. She whispered, "You were afraid, Papa, but you still wrote it down." Outside, the town looked peaceful again. Flowers on windowsills, children laughing near the square, but every street held shadows. The mayor's old office was now a cafe, yet the foundations beneath still carry scorch marks from 1945. Beneath those stones, history slept uneasily. The diary's final chapter had been read countless times by historians, journalists, and soldiers, but no one could truly capture what it meant. Not just a story of guilt, but of awakening. In those pages, Heinrich Falk had written about how people could be trapped between survival and morality, how silence, once chosen to protect, could become the very thing that destroys. When truth becomes dangerous, one entry said, the bravest act is to whisper it anyway. Liesel walked through the rain-soaked streets, her umbrella trembling in the wind. She stopped near the church, rebuilt with new bells. She remembered being a little girl, hiding under the altar when bombs fell outside. She remembered her father's voice, promising that someday she'd understand why he couldn't run. Now, she finally did. She placed a single white flower by the wall of remembrance, where the names of those lost in 1945 were engraved. Among them, a new plaque had been added, Mayor Heinrich Falk, 1889 to 1945. He tried to make peace and silence. Lightning flashed above the hills, illuminating the town for a heartbeat, the ruins, the rebirth, the ghosts. And then it was gone, swallowed by the dark. In that moment, it felt as if time folded, the mayor's hand still writing in his diary, his daughter still searching for his voice, and the world still trying to learn from both. A century might pass, but the diary would remain, ink fading slowly, words alive forever. And as the last echo of thunder rolled away, Liesel whispered one final line, not to the diary, but to the memory of every soul lost to silence. Now the world knows, Papa, your truth didn't die with the war. The storm faded into quiet. The night swallowed the town whole, and only the rain remained, falling softly over a place where history once wept and finally found peace.